The morning Connor Briggs walked into the Harlow Grand, he was wearing the same flannel jacket he'd worn to pick up his daughter from school the day before. There was a streak of dried paint on his left sleeve, pale gray, the color of the west-facing wall he'd touched up in the garage before sunrise. He carried a rolled-up set of blueprints under one arm and a coffee thermos in the other hand, and he held the lobby door open for a woman in a camel coat who didn't look back at him when she walked through. He was used to that. The Harlow Grand sat at the corner of Burrard and West Georgia in downtown Vancouver, 42 floors of curved glass and pale limestone that caught the morning light off Burrard Inlet and threw it back in long amber strips across the pavement. It had opened 18 months ago, and in those 18 months it had become the kind of hotel that people photographed from the sidewalk even when they had no reason to go inside. The lobby ceiling was 22 feet high. The floral arrangements were changed every Monday and Thursday. The concierge wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's rent. Connor had designed the staircase, not the whole hotel that had been a firm out of Toronto, a glass and steel outfit with an office on King Street that had won the commission back in 2019. But the central staircase, the sweeping curve of white oak and brushed steel that rose from the lobby to the mezzanine, like something borrowed from a different era that had been his. A subcontract quietly awarded through a mutual acquaintance, the kind of job that doesn't come with a plaque on the wall or a mention in the architecture magazine that covered the opening. Just a wire transfer and a handshake, and then his drawings built into someone else's building. He was here because one of the oak handrail joints had developed a hairline crack. The hotel's facilities manager had called him 3 days ago, her voice careful, apologetic in the way that people are when they need something from you, but don't want to admit it. Connor had said he'd come have a look. He crossed the lobby slowly, taking in the light, the way the morning came through the south-facing glass and fell across the limestone floor in a pattern that hadn't quite matched his original drawings. Someone had shifted the interior planter arrangement. It changed the shadows. He made a mental note and kept walking. The front desk was staffed by 2 people, a young man with very good posture and a woman about Connor's age whose name tag read Margot. Neither of them looked up as he approached. "Morning," Connor said. "I'm here to look at the main staircase. Facilities called me in, hairline fracture in one of the handrail joints." Margot looked up then. She took in the flannel jacket, the paint streak, the blueprints, the coffee thermos with the Canucks logo worn soft from the dishwasher. "Deliveries come through the loading bay on Thurlow," she said. "Around the back of the building, there's signage." Connor paused. "I'm not making a delivery? Trade's access is also through the Thurlow entrance," she said, and her voice had the particular flatness of someone who has said the same sentence many times and no longer hears it as anything other than policy. "You'll need to check in with the facilities coordinator there. They'll issue you a visitor's pass." "The facilities coordinator is who called me," Connor said. Margot was already looking at her screen. He stood there for a moment. The lobby smelled like white tea and cedar. Someone's luggage cart rolled across the limestone behind him, the wheels clicking in a rhythm that echoed up into the high ceiling. He looked up at the staircase, his staircase, though he would never have said it that way, and he could see, even from here, the faint misalignment at the third handrail joint where the oak had shifted 0.5 millimeter, and the steel bracket had done what steel brackets do when they're holding something they weren't quite meant to hold. He picked up his thermos and went around to Thurlow. Across the city, in a glass-walled office on the 14th floor of a building in Cole Harbor, Adrienne Voss was being interrupted for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. She was the regional director of hospitality development for Stonebridge Properties, which meant she was responsible for a portfolio of 11 hotels across Western Canada and had on any given morning approximately 400 things competing for her attention. She managed this the way she managed most things, methodically, with color-coded folders and a standing rule that anyone who requested a meeting had to submit an agenda in advance. Her assistant, a 26-year-old named Kyle who respected the rule but not always the spirit of it, knocked and opened the door in one motion. "Whitmore is here," Kyle said. Adrienne didn't look up from the site report she was reading. "Whitmore isn't on my calendar until 11. He says it's urgent." Everything Whitmore considers urgent turns out to be either a misunderstanding or a problem he created himself. "He's already in the boardroom," Kyle said. and there was something in his voice that made Adrian set down her pen. Gerald Whitmore was the general manager of the Harlow Grand. He was 54 years old, had an MBA from Queens, and a particular way of standing in doorways that suggested he believed the doorway was grateful for the opportunity. He had been in his role for 11 months. In those 11 months, he had renegotiated the towel supplier contract, implemented a new loyalty program tier, and fired 3 members of the service staff for reasons that, in Adrian's considered view, had more to do with his personal aesthetic preferences than any actual performance issue. She had the file on that. She had a file on most things. She found him in the boardroom, standing at the window with his behind his back, looking out at the inlet with the expression of a man who believes the view exists for his benefit. "Gerald," she said. He turned. He was wearing a suit the color of a rain cloud, with a pocket square that matched. "Adrienne, I appreciate you making time." "I haven't made time," she said. "You're in my boardroom at 8:47 on a Tuesday." "What's happened?" He pulled out a chair but didn't sit. "The staircase issue. The hairline fracture. A more significant concern than initially described, I think." He produced a folder. He always produced folders, which Adrian might have respected if the folders weren't usually thin on substance. "I've been doing some research on the subcontractor who did the original installation. His company is a one-man operation out of North Fan. No commercial portfolio to speak of. No major hotel projects in his background. I'm questioning whether we should be allowing him on site for assessment at all, given the reputational implications if this turns out to be a structural failure." Adrienne looked at the folder. She didn't take it. "Who are you talking about?" "Man named Briggs. Connor Briggs. Apparently he was brought in through some kind of informal referral arrangement during the original build. Not our standard vendor process." "I know who Briggs is," Adrian said. Something shifted in Whitmore's expression. "Not much. Just a slight recalibration, the kind that happens when a person realizes the conversation may not be going in the direction they assumed." "You've worked with him before?" "I've worked with him for 11 years, Adrian said. She said it simply, not to make a point, though it made one anyway. Gerald Whitmore set down his folder. Connor had been on site for 20 minutes when the facilities coordinator, a practical, efficient woman named Sandra who had clearly been doing her job long enough not to be rattled by anything, handed him a visitor's pass and walked him to the staircase without commentary on his jacket or his thermos. He crouched at the third handrail joint and ran his thumb along the seam between the oak and the steel bracket. The crack was exactly where he'd expected it, running 3 centimeters along the grain in a direction that told him the bracket had been installed at a fractionally incorrect angle. Not by him, he was reasonably certain, but by someone working from his drawings who'd made the kind of small adjustment that seems inconsequential until 18 months later when the wood starts talking back. "Aesthetic or structural?" Sandra asked. "Aesthetic for now," Connor said. "But the bracket needs to come out and go back in right, or in another year you're looking at structural." He sat back on his heels. "The good news is it's a half-day job if someone good does it. Are you available this week?" "Thursday afternoon." Sandra wrote it down. She was the kind of person Connor liked. Direct, unbothered, oriented toward solutions. He was about to ask her whether the loading dock access had changed since the original build when he heard footsteps crossing the lobby. And the quality of the sound changed, the way sounds do in a large space when the person making them believes they own the acoustics. Sandra. The voice belonged to a man in a rain-cloud suit. He was looking at Connor the way some people look at a piece of furniture that has appeared in the wrong room. "What's the status here?" "Mr. Briggs has identified the source of the fracture," Sandra said. "It's the bracket on joint 3. He can come back Thursday to Mr. Briggs." Whitmore said it like he was testing the weight of it. "You're the subcontractor who did the original installation." Connor stood up. He was not a tall man, 5'10" in boots, but he had spent enough years working with his hands that he carried himself in a way that took up the right amount of space without apology. "That's right. I've been reviewing your firm's credentials," Whitmore said. "I have some concerns about the scope of experience that was brought to bear on a project of this profile." Connor looked at him. "The Harlow Grand has 42 floors and a lobby that was featured in Azure magazine." Whitmore continued. "The standard of craftsmanship expected here is—" "The bracket was installed by a third-party carpenter working from my drawings," Connor said. "The error is in the installation angle, not the design." I can show you the original specification if you'd like, the tolerances I called for, and where the deviation occurred." He held up the blueprints. Whitmore did not take them. "I think what might be most appropriate," Whitmore said, "is if we engaged our standard vendor network to assess this. Bring in someone with a broader commercial portfolio. No reflection on your work, of course, but for a property of this." "Gerald!" The voice came from the mezzanine. Connor looked up. A woman was standing at the top of his staircase, one hand resting lightly on the handrail, the good section, the section that was holding, and she was looking down at the lobby with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely precise. Adrienne Voss descended the staircase the way she did most things, which was without hurry and without wasted movement. She was wearing a dark blazer over a white shirt and her hair was pulled back, and she was carrying a folder of her own, though she held it at her side rather than producing it as a prop. She reached the bottom and looked at Whitmore. "I'd like you to meet Connor Briggs," she said. "He designed the Meridian Center staircase, the atrium installation at the Claridge in Calgary, and the central feature at the Bayside in Halifax, which, if you checked the portfolio I sent you when you started, you would have listed under featured projects." She paused. "He also designed this staircase, which, for the record, is the single most photographed architectural element in this building's public coverage. I have the press file if you'd like to review it." Whitmore was very still. "Mr. Briggs," Adrienne said, turning to Connor, "I'm sorry for the confusion this morning. I understand you were directed to the Thurlow entrance." "Sandra sorted it out," Connor said. Sandra, to her credit, looked at neither of them. "Thursday still works for you?" Adrienne asked. "Thursday works." Adrienne nodded. Then she looked at Whitmore again. "Gerald, I'll need 30 minutes with you after lunch. Bring the vendor review you mentioned. We should talk about the process." She said it, the way you say something, when the conversation about the process is not going to be comfortable for the person who initiated the wrong process. Then she walked back toward the elevator, and the lobby went quiet except for the wheels of a luggage cart clicking across the limestone, and Connor crouched back down beside the handrail joint and went back to work. He didn't think about it much on the drive home. That was the thing about having done this long enough. You developed a tolerance for the Whitmores of the world, not in the sense of accepting them, but in the sense of understanding they were weather. They moved through. You waited. What he did think about was the bracket angle, and whether Sandra would be able to source the same steel finish for the replacement, and whether his daughter Marigold had remembered to take her lunch out of the fridge because he'd made her a cheese and apple sandwich the way she liked it, and the last time he'd forgotten to remind her she'd left it until Wednesday. Marigold was 7. She had his coloring, dark hair, gray eyes, and her mother's way of asking questions, which was to ask them directly and then wait in absolute silence for the full answer. She had started calling him Briggs lately, in the way that children sometimes try on formality as a kind of experiment, and he had decided to find it funny. He picked her up at 3:15 from the school on Lynn Valley Road. She came through the gate carrying her backpack in one hand and a piece of paper in the other, her jacket half zipped the way it always was. "Did you eat the sandwich?" he said. "Yes," she said, which he was 60% sure was true. She held up the paper. It was a drawing, a building, rendered in purple crayon, with a staircase that curled up through the middle of it like a ribbon. "We had to draw something our parent makes." Connor took the paper. He looked at the staircase. "That's pretty accurate," he said. "I made it taller," she said, "because in real life it's not tall enough. What would make it tall enough?" She considered this seriously. "If it went all the way to space, that's a longer project," he said. "We'd need more brackets." She took his hand and they walked to the car, and he thought about nothing except the bracket for a while, and then about the sandwich, and then about nothing at all for a few minutes, which was the closest he got to peace on most days, and it was enough. Adrienne had her meeting with Whitmore at 1:30. She had been in this kind of meeting before. Not this specific meeting, with this specific folder on this specific table in this specific building, but the category of meeting, the geometry of it. A person across from her who had made a decision based on an incomplete picture and was now slowly understanding the full dimensions of what they'd done. She didn't enjoy these meetings. She didn't dislike them either. She thought of them as load-bearing, structurally necessary, the kind of thing that determined whether the rest of the building stood up. "The vendor assessment process exists for a reason," she said. "I want to be clear about that. The intent is sound. Whitmore nodded carefully. What I want you to understand is that there is a difference between applying a process correctly and using a process to create distance between yourself and something that makes you uncomfortable. She set her folder on the table. She still hadn't opened it. Mr. Briggs made you uncomfortable this morning. That's what this was. The credentials concern was a rationale, not a reason. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. The standard of this property was partially built by the man you tried to send to the loading dock, Adrian said. And I'm not telling you that to embarrass you. I'm telling you because I need you to understand, going forward, that the people in this building who look the most ordinary are often the ones whose work the rest of the building depends on. She paused. That's something worth knowing. The afternoon light came through the boardroom windows in long strips, the same light that the lobby collected every morning off the inlet and threw back at the pavement. Whitmore looked at his folder. He didn't open it either. I'll revise the assessment protocol, he said. Thank you, Adrian said. She picked up her folder and stood. At the door she paused. Not for effect, but because a thought had arrived that seemed worth adding. The staircase, Gerald. When you walk through that lobby, do you look at it? He considered. Yes, that's his, she said. Every time. She left him there with the afternoon light and the folder and whatever he made of that. On Thursday, Connor was back at the Harlow Grand by 1 in the afternoon. He came through the front entrance this time, not because he needed to make a point, but because Sandra had called ahead and left his name at the desk. And Margot, without commentary, without the particular flatness of Tuesday morning, handed him a pass and directed him to the staircase. He set up his tools on a drop cloth he'd laid across the limestone floor. He had brought the right bracket, the right steel finish, and a small spirit level that had belonged to his grandfather and still read true. The lobby moved around him, check-ins, check-outs, a conference group gathering near the elevator in matching lanyards, and he worked inside it the way he always worked, which was quietly and without urgency, and with the particular quality of attention that comes from caring genuinely about whether the thing you're making is right. He didn't notice Adrian until she was standing a few feet away, watching. How's it looking? She said. Good now. He held up the old bracket so she could see the angle deviation, barely perceptible, but there, whoever installed this was working fast. You can see where they adjusted off-center, probably trying to account for something in the floor surface. Adrian leaned in and looked. 2 millimeters, maybe 2.5, you can see that. I can see it, because I know what it's supposed to look like, he said. He set the bracket down and began positioning the new one. Most people can't. Most people walk up this staircase every day and just feel that it's good. They don't know why. Is that enough? Adrian asked. For the work? That people feel it without knowing why. Connor thought about it. He thought about Marigold's drawing, the purple crayon staircase going all the way to space. He thought about the light off Burrard Inlet and the way it moved through the lobby at different times of day, and how he had thought about that light for months before he'd drawn the first line of the railing curve. Yeah, he said, that's enough. Adrian looked at the staircase, the full sweep of it, the way the oak caught the afternoon light the same way the limestone caught the morning light, the whole building working the way a good building works, which is to say working together. She had spent 11 years shepherding projects like this one, fighting for the right subcontractors, building the vendor relationships that the Whitmores of the world tried to replace with protocols, and sometimes she wondered if anyone noticed. If the noticing was the point. She thought probably that the noticing was not the point. Same rate as last time, she said. Plus materials, Connor said. Fair. She left him to it. He worked through the afternoon, the lobby moving around him, the conference group dispersing, the luggage cart wheels clicking their particular rhythm across the limestone. At 3:45 he set the new bracket, checked it with his grandfather's level, checked it again and stood up. The handrail was true. He pressed his palm flat against the oak, the warmth of the wood, the slight give that good hardwood has when it's been properly fitted and is holding exactly the weight it was designed to hold. Below him the lobby went about its business. Above him the staircase rose in its long clean curve toward the mezzanine, and the afternoon light moved across it the way light moves across anything that is exactly what it's meant to be. He rolled up his drop cloth, collected his tools, and signed out at the front desk. Margot said, "Have a good afternoon." Connor said he would try his best. He drove north across the bridge and picked up Marigold at 3:15, and she had not eaten the sandwich, which he had expected, and she showed him a second drawing she had done at lunch. The same building, the same purple crayon staircase. But this time there was a small figure standing at the bottom of it. A man with a toolbox and a rolled-up piece of paper under one arm. "Is that me?" Connor said. "That's Briggs," she said, which was not an answer and also entirely one. He put the drawing on the passenger seat and drove home in the late afternoon light.